Hey there, and welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Big news today, or really late yesterday. The FCC announced late yesterday that they will be rejecting the long-form applications from SpaceX and LTD Broadband, two of the biggest winners in the Ardoff auction. Be right back. Thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So as I said, the FCC came out late yesterday, and they have announced that they are rejecting the applications of LTD Broadband and Starlink. These were two of the top bidders that won, or tentatively won, money in this auction, and they have been rejected. So you see here, applicants failed to meet program requirements and convinced the FCC to fund risky proposals. This is the press release from the FCC. The FCC today, this was yesterday, announced that it's rejecting the long-form applications of LTD Broadband and Starlink to recover support through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program. When it says recover support, what it means is this was a reverse auction, so all of the service providers, the operators that wanted to bid on areas that were considered unserved, basically, there were census blocks, and they could bid on census blocks, and it was a reverse auction, so each service provider that wanted to bid there would bid a certain amount of support, percentage of support that they were willing to accept for that area. And then as the clock continued on the auction, then they would accept less and less money until eventually somebody said, no, I'm not going to do it for that little amount of support. So then you had your winner, basically, by accepting the least amount. So these guys won in these areas, and again, two of the biggest ones. The Commission determined that these applications failed to demonstrate that the providers could deliver the promised service. Funding these vast proposed networks would not be the best use of limited U.S. Universal Service Funds, or USF dollars, to bring broadband to unserved areas across the United States, the Commission concluded. So RDOF is different from something like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is going to be paid by tax dollars, unfortunately paid by probably money they don't have, because we got trillions and trillions that we're spending lately. That's just money that we don't have that's going to be printed. But in this case, this is money that consumers are paying universal service funds, that junk fee on your phone bill. So that's where that money is coming from, and they're saying that it's not the best use of those dollars to apply it to these service providers. Now, some of what may be playing into this is the fact that there's $45+ billion hanging out there in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, part of the BEAD program of that. So they may have been looking at this and saying, you know what, we don't need to be doing this risky stuff when we're already putting another $45 billion out there, and they're really trying to focus on what they're calling reliable internet and kind of future-proof internet, which would be something like, if at all possible, they want to do fiber. So that could be one reason. And then both of these companies have issues related to them as far as their RDOF applications. So it says, after careful legal, technical, and policy review, we're rejecting these applications. We cannot afford to subsidize ventures that are not delivering the promised speeds or not likely to meet program requirements. Starlink's technology has real promise, continued Chairman Rosenworcel. She's the chairwoman of the FCC. But the question before us was whether to publicly subsidize its still developing technology for consumer broadband, which requires that users purchase a $600 dish with nearly $900 million in universal service funds until 2032. So these funds, this $900 million, would be doled out over 10 years. That's the way the RDOF program works. So they get the money over 10 years. So the question is, what is this service going to be looking like in 10 years, and what other options would there be? So one of the issues would be that if you authorize this for Starlink, which the only infrastructure they have is up in space, right? So it's not like they're having to put in additional infrastructure necessarily to serve these areas. They would have to actually launch more satellites. I shouldn't say that, but it's not like they're targeting specific areas. They'd launch more satellites. It's unproven. The satellites have a lifespan of about 5 years. So after 5 years or so, they start to deorbit, and they've got to constantly keep launching satellites to be able to do that. And they've not had the best speeds related to the service. It's been declining, as it'll say here. In the initial auction results announced December 7, 2020, LTD Broadband won $1.3 billion, and SpaceX won $885.5 million. Although LTD was a relatively small fixed wireless provider before the auction, it was the largest winning bidder in the auction, submitting winning bids in 15 states. And that's one of the issues there, is this is a relatively unknown fixed wireless provider prior to this. And they bid in the gigabit tier. Now, Starlink did not, because they knew there's no way they're going to get gigabit speeds, certainly with their technology today. But LTD did bid in the gigabit realm, and that's questionable as to whether they could do that with wireless. They had come out and said we're going to be doing that with actually fiber. I think they were saying fiber, strictly fiber, and not that. But they don't have that experience, so that might have been part of the issue. Subsequently, it failed to timely receive eligible telecommunications carrier status in 7 states. That's ETC status, and that's a requirement that you get that status from something like the public service utility in a state, and that means that you can provide voice service in the state, and that is a requirement of Ardoff. In addition to providing a broadband connection, you need to be able to provide voice service as well. So that rendered it ineligible for those states for support. So they had already had some defaults, LTD broadband, in some states where they did not get ETC status. They were delayed in that, and they had some issues where they blamed an attorney who did not file the right paperwork or on timely basis. So there was a lot already going on with LTD broadband where they were not making a good impression, let's say, for the FCC. Ultimately, the FCC review concluded that LTD was not reasonably capable of deploying a network of the scope, scale, and size required by LTD's extensive winning bids. The Commission separately announced that it is ready to authorize $21 million in broadband funding to 3 companies to deploy gigabit service to almost 15,000 locations in 4 states: Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. And I'm going to show who those folks were here in a minute. To date, the Ardoff program has authorized more than $5 billion in funding to bring primarily fiber gigabit broadband service to over 3 million locations in 47 states. And originally, the tentative amount that was kind of committed from all the winners was, I think, about $9.3 billion, if I remember, something along those lines. So $5 billion of that's been awarded, and I don't know if there's a whole lot left. We'll see today. Again, they have 3, I would call minor providers that have come out and won some money. Early on in this process, they were coming out, and there were lots of different providers that were being awarded money. Then it slowed down, and it's funny, just the other day, I did a broadcast about the fact that they had authorized some funds for some operators where they had been on the ready to authorize list months before. So that whole process had slowed down. These are ready to authorize. So these are the next 3 that are ready to authorize that we'll be looking at here in a minute. So one of the issues, again, with these funds being the Infrastructure Act funds being out there in the future that we're going to have access to, is if they had awarded this to Starlink and to LTD Broadband, then that would be taking those areas, those census blocks, full census blocks, off of the broadband map, because the broadband map that the FCC is working on, if somebody gets RDOF funds, that's going to be considered an area that's going to be served, even if it's going to be in process, because those are federal dollars that are going towards bringing broadband to those locations. So we don't want to be, the last thing we want to be doing is spending money in an area and then spending more money in an area to overbuild that. So they're trying to get all areas that are unserved and underserved covered, so we don't want to be overbuilding before we do that. So if you had all of this money that was allocated to Starlink and LTD Broadband, and then they really don't get their act together, maybe they can't reach the speeds that they're supposed to reach, or they're not able to deploy because they have, like with LTD Broadband, just not delivering on what they're supposed to be delivering, then that is an issue. Then suddenly you've got all of these areas that were on the FCC broadband map, then suddenly will not have service, and maybe we've already spent the BEAD funds. So that's a big reason I think that the FCC is doing this. I was saying the other day, I thought maybe they would not tell these guys that because they don't have to. It wasn't required that they come out and say, hey, we're going to reject your applications. They could have just left it hanging out there, from what I had heard. But they did come out and say that they were rejected. So that's the press release. There's also the public notice here. Rural Digital Opportunity Fund support for 80 winning bids ready to be authorized. Bid defaults announced. So they announced the bid defaults that I was just talking about. And they're ready to be authorized. What that is the FCC has reviewed their long form applications, and they said, okay, you guys are ready. We're going to authorize you. But you've got 2 more steps, and those 2 steps are, we need to get a letter of credit from you, and we need to get a bankruptcy letter from an attorney that says, if you get these funds, but then you go into bankruptcy, then these funds will not be part of that bankruptcy process. So those are the last 2 steps that these companies that were announced ready to authorize will have to do. And the bid defaults are obviously LTD Broadband and Starlink, and there's just a couple of others on there as well, a couple of minor defaults. And there was nothing in here, so I'm going to scroll down to one part. It talks about, some of the companies that had gotten waivers but were considered ready to authorize. So some of the ones that won, there's information on those that you could read through here. But then mentions here on the defaults, the Bureau has concluded in review of LTD Broadband and Starlink's long-form applications, concluded its review. LTD proposes to deploy gigabit fiber, so they were going to go strictly fiber, to 475,616 estimated locations in 11 states. And that's a huge job for this small wireless provider, then suddenly be able to do this much fiber in 11 states. So, and then Starlink, relying upon a nascent LEO satellite technology and the ability to timely deploy future satellites to manage recognized capacity constraints while maintaining broadband speeds to both RDOF and non-RDOF customers, seeks funding to provide 100 by 20, so that was the tier that they bid in, low latency service to 642,925 estimated locations in 35 states. So what Starlink did was they said, okay, well, what's open? I mean, we can get satellites up in the air. We've already got some in the air. We can get more in the air. What's open? And they just bid in various locations, including places that really didn't need broadband, like a parking lot. If they saw a parking lot in the middle of a urban area and it said it didn't have broadband, they went ahead and bid on that. Now, the FCC should not have included that in their list of census blocks, but that was what Starlink was doing. They were like, where can we bid? And they bid. And they were able to underbid a lot of people that had bid in those areas, which was did not make a lot of people happy that they were bidding in some areas where really a fiber provider could be able to provide service there. It wasn't, let's say, it wasn't a really high cost or maybe a really high difficult situation, but Starlink won. So then you're locking fiber out of that territory. So that was a real problem. Says the commission, let's see, where was I here? The Bureau has determined that based on the totality of the long-form applications, the expansive service areas reflected in their winning bids, and their inadequate responses to the Bureau's follow-up questions, LTD and Starlink are not reasonably capable of complying with the Commission's requirements. The Commission has an obligation to protect our limited USF funds and to avoid extensive delays in providing needed service to rural areas, including by avoiding subsidizing risky proposals that promise faster speeds than they can deliver, and/or proposed deployment plans that are not realistic or that are predicated on aggressive assumptions and predictions. And obviously, that's one reason that these guys were able to underbid people, is maybe they weren't taking into account everything that was needed, and they were just a little bit too optimistic, maybe. We observed that Ookla data reported as of July 30th or 31st, 2022, indicated that Starlink speeds have been declining from the last quarter of 2021 to the second quarter of 2022. Including upload speeds that are falling well below 20 megabits per second. So that's interesting. They were watching the Ookla data. There were a lot of stories coming out about the Ookla data from Starlink. And when Starlink would launch some satellites into the constellation, and before they had a lot of customers, the speeds looked pretty good. But then as they add customers to that, then the speeds drop, and then they have to launch more satellites. So it's kind of an up and down thing. Accordingly, we deny LTD's and Starlink's long-form applications, and both are in default on all winning bids not already announced as defaulted. So LTD had some that were already announced as defaulted. Because LTD is defaulted on its remaining winning bids, we also dismiss as moot LTD's petition for reconsideration of the Bureau's denial of its request for additional time to obtain an ETC designation in Nebraska and North Dakota. So if I recall, LTD Broadband had dropped out of California. They were having some issues there, and they had filed this waiver request here to get an extension for Nebraska and North Dakota. So as I look through here, it did not mention specifically how much money, if any, these guys would have to pay due to these defaults. Now, you can see here, a lot of times on this it would say, when there's bid defaults, it'll say, well, this provider has to pay this much in defaults. It says the defaulter will be subject to a base forfeiture per violation of $3,000, and that violation is per census block, I believe. Yeah, a violation is defined as any form of default with respect to the census block group. In other words, there shall be separate violations for each census block group assigned in a bid, so that this base forfeiture amount is not disproportionate to the amount of a winning bidder's bid. The Commission has limited the total base forfeiture to 15% of the bidder's total assigned support for the bid for the support term. So basically they have however much the bid was and money they'd be getting in each census block, then they have to pay 15% of that in default, which is a huge amount of money. But there's no mention in here what Starlink and LTD Broadband would have to pay. And I don't know what the FCC is going to do with that, because they're the ones who turned down the application. So the FCC said, no, we're not going to accept it, as opposed to one of these, LTD Broadband or Starlink saying, never mind, we don't want to do it. This is the FCC saying, we're going to deny this. So I don't know if they're going to actually fine these guys or not. Like I say, it would be a huge amount of money. Certainly, I would think it would put somebody like LTD Broadband out of business. Elon Musk has got a lot of money, but I'd be surprised if they actually were to go the full amount on these defaults. Now they may decide, since they might feel that these guys put in bids that were not realistic, that maybe they wasted a lot of people's time, including the FCC, and they locked some areas down that were not getting RDOF funding now. I don't think these areas will be the areas that are being defaulted on. I don't think that the FCC is going to be awarding anything there. I think everything's probably just going to wait until the BEAD money comes out, and that these areas will be available for that money. So that would be my guess. So here you've got the bids in default, and you can see there are a couple before we get to LTD Broadband. So you got AB Indiana, LCC. It looks like they defaulted on one census block, 20 locations, and you can see the amount of money there. Then you got Fond du Lac Communications, that's in Minnesota. So the first one, Florida, that's Minnesota. So they've got some census blocks, looks like 4 census blocks, and you can see the money here that they, so I think they might have to pay up to 15% of this amount, maybe. Now, it's very possible that they've gotten, that these are just 4 areas that they've defaulted on. I don't remember this company, but that they've won money elsewhere that they're going to be getting funds for. So, but then you start with LTD Broadband. So you can see the length of this, right up here is my scroll bar. So you can see the length of this document. So you got LTD Broadband, and you got all of these census blocks, the number of locations in each one. You can see as I scroll down here, I mean, you just see the dollars adding up. I mean, here's the census block with 45, what is this number again? 45, that's a census block group, excuse me. So census block group with 45 census blocks, 380 locations, and that was like 2 million right there. So again, here's my scroll bar. So that's all, this is all LTD Broadband as I scroll down here until I get to about a third of the way a page, a third of the way down, I think. Still coming down. Eventually we'll get to SpaceX. LTD. Whoops, there we go. There's Starlink. So here it says Starlink. So between them, there's one company as well, Shenandoah Cable Television. They had a census block group with 96 census blocks, 909 locations, 845,000 that they are defaulting on. Then you got Starlink. So here I am on page 356 of 1,273. Now again, LTD Broadband had some defaults prior to this, so this is not all of their defaults that we saw for LTD Broadband, but this is basically everything that Starlink bid on. You can see the census block groups and the census blocks and the locations. And again, I'm just going to scroll all the way down to the page here. So all the way down to the end, 1,273 of 1,273. So you see the rest of it's Starlink. So that's a lot of locations. So again, I don't know what the FCC is going to do as far as any fines or forfeitures from this default, if they would even plan on doing that. Since Starlink's not going to get any money at all, I don't know if they'd do anything. Now, just to give you a sense of the top 10 winners for Ardoff, these were the winners. So again, this was back from 2020. So this auction took place in 2020. So you can see the top 10, and LTD Broadband was your #1 winner. So you can see they were #1 with $1.3 billion. You can see the number of locations, the number of states. Fiber and fixed wireless technology, although they had come out later and said they'd be doing all fiber when people were saying they couldn't get it done with fixed wireless. Charter, they've won a lot. So some of these have already gotten money. You've got Charter, you got the Rural Electric Cooperative Consortium, and each one of these have had defaults as well, but they've also gotten a lot of the areas that they bid on, they're getting money. Then you got SpaceX, so that was #4 on this list. And again, none of this, they're not going to be getting any of this money. The rest of these have gotten, well, that's true actually. Windstream, they've gotten money. Nextlink, I believe that Nextlink, Resound Networks, and Starry have not gotten any funds yet. So these are still hanging out there as well. Nextlink, you see, that's a fixed wireless. So they have had some news releases come out and say, hey, you know, we've been able to get a gigabit service using this technology over this distance. So they've been trying to get the news in their favor, and they've been obviously behind the scenes talking to the FCC about that, whereas Starlink, I'm sure Starlink was talking to the FCC as well, but Starlink was getting negative press because of the Ookla results. Nextlink and Resound Networks also have been coming out and talking about how they've been able to get 1 gig speeds with wireless. It says here that Resound is using fiber and fixed wireless. Really, everybody's got to do fiber and fixed wireless because, I mean, I suppose you could try to do fixed wireless the whole way, but most of them are going to have fiber backhauls and maybe doing fixed wireless, or maybe the other way around. Maybe they could do fixed wireless backhaul and do fiber. Then you got Starry, fixed fiber and fixed wireless. So again, they've not heard. And again, I think it's because of the fixed wireless element that the FCC has been holding off on that. So I guess we'll have to see what happens with those. But that's 3 more in the top 10 that have not received any money. And then you've got CenturyLink, number 10 on the list. They've gotten a lot of money as well. And then finally, I was going to show you who. I need to make this bigger. Who won the amounts here. So let me make that a little smaller there. Here we go. So these were the winners. So these are the ones that are ready to authorize now. And again, supposedly they have 2 weeks to get these final 2 items in, which again would be that letter of credit and that bankruptcy letter. But again, I noticed that the last authorization that was done, I think it was Friday last week, that authorization, some of those people were ready to authorize like months before, back in May, and then they showed up on the authorized list. So I don't know if that was a delay on the FCC's part, or if they were being kind of lenient on those operators and getting those last 2 items in. I'm sure they want to provide some leeway because they've already had to reject all of this money. So, but these guys supposedly have 2 weeks to get that final paperwork in, and you can see eFiber San Juan LLC, not in Puerto Rico, in Utah. And 3 census blocks, 123 census block groups, 123 census blocks, 1,085 locations there in Utah. And you can see they're getting 7.5 million. And that averages out to about $6,800 per location. And that tends to be hovering around the highest amount that people get. Usually you see 6,000 to 7,000 as being the highest amount per location that people are getting. Could mean that they bid in an area where there was not much competition. It could be that it's a very high cost area. I don't know what. Utah could certainly be in a very rural area with very few customers, let's say, maybe several miles per customer. That could be the reason there. Then you've got Monster Broadband in Tennessee and Texas, 57 census block groups, 1,574 census blocks, and that's 11,000 locations. And you can see they got less money, 5 million, so they're only at $518 or $518 per location. But that might be less costly for them to do. There might have been more competition, which brought that amount of support down. We don't know what. I didn't look into that. So we've got Northern Arapaho Tribal Industries. So this is a tribal entity in Wyoming, and again, they're getting about kind of middle of the road there, $3,200 in support for 2,408 locations in Wyoming. So, so those are the winners, and then we saw the losers, LTD Broadband and SpaceX, and so we've been kind of waiting for this, especially these 2. LTD and Broadband, there were real questions about them. LTD being the biggest winner with a small company, very little experience. And then SpaceX bidding on the lower tier, but basically then locking out lots of parts on the map from, let's say, fiber service, if it would be possible. So that was a real issue for people, and it looks like the FCC has come down on the side of, you know what, we're not gonna gamble on these locations. We want to make sure that everybody gets the best possible future-proof service. And I'm sure, again, a factor was that we've got over $40 billion out there in BEAD that can be applied to these locations now. So I think that's what we're going to see happen. I see a question here from a Conway fan. I have a question that's not related to the topic, but how long do pole inspection replacements usually take? I've seen my electric company inspecting poles in front of my home since April. That's a real variable because sometimes there's the incumbent, depending on if they're providing service, there may be, kind of slow walking that because they may be trying to get their own service up, or they may already be providing service, and they don't necessarily want to go out of their way for a competitor that's coming in. I think in your case, I don't think that would be the case. You're saying that they're kind of doing that now. So it does take some time. They've got to go out and they've got to do a walk out on all of the poles and look at them, and then they might have to do some make-ready work and see if poles need to be replaced. If they say, well, these poles are already old, we don't want to put any more infrastructure on them. So it's really a variable, but it's good news for you, the fact that they are out there inspecting the poles, because that does probably mean that they're doing this inspection now, and then they'll determine if any of those need to be replaced. And then there's a whole question of who has to pay for that replacement. It may be that the electric company, if the FCC has come out and said that if the pole already really needed to be replaced, then you can't really require the internet service provider to bear the full cost of that. Maybe they bear part of that, or maybe they bear none of that, depending on the pole and if it was ready to fall down. Versus if it's a pole in fairly good shape, but it needs to be replaced just to add the infrastructure. So there's a lot of questions there. So it can take some time, but the good news is that they're out there looking at it. So I think that's a positive thing for you. I know you're waiting for broadband there, and it's coming. I know it's going to take some time now. I was thinking of you yesterday because I did a video about a guy in Michigan who was being told that it was going to cost him $50,000. Comcast told him, we'll extend broadband to your home. It'll be $50,000. And it sounds like a lot of money, but there's, it really does take a lot of work to get broadband to his home. So he said, well, I've got a couple options. I can move. I can pay the $50,000, or I can become my own ISP. And if I think of those three things, I think, well, let's see. I'm not going to pay $50,000. I guess I either move or I suck it up and I say, well, I'm just going to wait for service. But he decided to become his own ISP, and he's built a fiber ISP. He's become a telephone company. He actually filed for a tariff, and he signed up people in his neighborhood. He had 12 customers, and he had 30 customers. Now he's got 70 customers, and he just got $2.3 million through the state from ARPA funds to be able to extend out to another 411 subscribers. And he thinks he's going to be able to do up to 600 because he's going to be passing other places as well. So that was yesterday's video. You might find that interesting, because I was thinking of you. It's like you could always take that step. But I think it's looking good for you that you've got people inspecting the poles. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and click the little subscribe button there on YouTube. And there's also one down on the right side of the video if you look at that. And then not on this screen. If you click on this screen right here, it's just an image, it won't work. Click the little bell when you subscribe and you'll be notified. If you like the video, go ahead and click the thumbs up. I appreciate that. And I will see you next time for Broadband Deployment News. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.